in my body is where I really learn Aikido. The words are not going to communicate whatever the lesson is, and I'm not going to communicate what the lesson is. Your body is going to communicate the lesson of Aikido to your mind and spirit. That's what's happening. For me, at least, that's what's happening. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not even teaching you what to do. I'm showing your body the shape that it could make so that it can inform your mind and spirit. This has been my experience of my learning of Aikido. Physicality of the training is what teaches me. That's where I really learn Aikido, in my body.
So this conversation is in a series of conversations around martial arts, particularly the martial arts of the samurais known as Aikido. And as I came to Aikido, like many people, I had the burning question, is Aikido in fact an effective martial arts? Will it help me win a street fight? Or will it help me partake in a mixed martial arts tournament? And while that's a valid question, it took me nearly 2 years of practicing Aikido to realize that the question itself might be limited in its perspective. And I've had the privilege of training Aikido for the past 2 years under the guidance of a remarkable teacher, our guest today, Nathan Feileacan. What I love about Nathan is that he's one of the kindest human beings that I know, and he's genuinely concerned about the inner and outer development of his students. And to me, that in itself is a teaching. One of the key themes in this conversation, which perhaps might come to you as a shocking surprise, is that Aikido, in fact, is a transformatory practice. It's more similar to yoga and Sufism than perhaps it is to boxing, mixed martial arts, or kickboxing. So if all of that sounds intriguing to you, then I hope that you'll join in this conversation. And if you like it, please consider sharing it with your friends. And lastly, we at Potential Paradigms are a team, and we're doing a labor of love and are struggling to support ourselves. So if you're feeling generous, please consider supporting us. There is a link to a tip jar above and in the show notes below. And I thank you.
When you suggested that you might want to interview me, I was trying to figure out what I was expert enough in to warrant being interviewed for. And it's going back and forth thinking like, oh, I'm inexpert in so many things. Like, you know, I have experience in Aikido, but not expertise. I have experience in a little bit of Japanese language, but not even nearing fluency. I have experience in all these different things, but I was trying to identify the piece that I felt I could share any level of expertise with. And the only thing I could come up with was my own experience. My own experience has definitely not led me to be an expert at being me, but that's my progress really in my Aikido journey.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and sort of before we dive in, thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah.
So why I'm here today is because I love martial arts since I was a kid, influenced starting perhaps with Bruce Lee movies and doing some Taekwondo, and over the years doing Capoeira, which is Brazilian martial arts, and then many years later being led to Aikido more recently. And you're my sensei, and I'm here at this lovely dojo in Santa Rosa, Sebastopol, California.
Yeah.
And so first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to be in your dojo and in the vibration of the dojo and set up this. And thank you for helping with the setup.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my pleasure.
So as I was saying, I have a deep love for martial art, and as I've gotten to Aikido, I just feel very grateful because for myself, through my intermittent martial arts journey, I was always seeking something. And as I got to Aikido, I think very fast, perhaps in a couple of months, it started to become apparent that I was sort of led here, and my joining Aikido was not a happenstance.
Mm-hmm.
There were some breadcrumbs that sort of got me here, but in any case, it seemed like Aikido, first and foremost, seemed to me placed the spiritual aspects of being a warrior first at the forefront, at the beginning of your journey. Whereas I feel like in other martial arts, I had trouble finding what is that, apart from all the flashy stuff that I was chasing, what was it that I was seeking? So I felt very fortunate, and surprisingly, it's just been a year, a little more than a year, and my gratitude and joy seems to deepen at multiple levels. So you being my sensei, thank you for that opportunity, and maybe that's a context to sort of dive in as to what Aikido. Well, why did you choose Aikido?
Yeah, my choice of Aikido, as you phrased it, is accidental and very gradual. You mentioned that realization coming to you very seemingly early on, right, within the first year of your practice. And for me, it was something that took years and maybe even more than a decade to realize that this was something that was a lifelong pursuit. I was 18 years old when I started Aikido, and I had been interested in philosophy and martial arts, and especially drawn to the East from my studies of just reading and watching and being exposed through high school. Tai Chi was a sort of starting point for me because a high school girlfriend's dad sort of turned me on to the spiritual and martial components of Tai Chi practice and the benefits to health and spirit. And I dabbled as much as a 16, 17-year-old can in Tai Chi, and then realized very quickly that at that age, what I needed was more movement and more connection and more human connection and interaction, physical interaction too. And I was lucky enough to land at the university, started at Cinema State University. And a new friend at the university suggested that I might like Aikido. And I did. And that was it. It was, in hindsight, it felt like a very simple adoration for the movement and the physicality and the exercise. And I came back to it. The semester ended and I came back to it. The school year ended and I came back to it. And I actually ended up following that instructor to their dojo in Santa Rosa, Jay Bell and Lynn Johnston, and trained with them at their dojo. And from there, it just sort of snowballed. Snowballed is maybe the wrong metaphor because it happened very slowly. It was so gradual for me that it was when it was convenient. It was very much a relationship of convenience at that stage in my life. My teenage years and early 20s, life gets in the way. So it was difficult to find it as really like a passion. Later on, when I started teaching and started teaching kids classes, started teaching adult classes, went to Toyin Sensei, my instructor moved to the Philippines and handed the dojo over to me. At that point, I thought, oh, I guess I have to take this seriously now. It always felt like just something that I was doing and not something that I was living, a life that I was really living. Teaching changed my relationship with it for sure. And always it's been a delight. It's been a delight to train. It's been a delight to learn. It's been a delight to teach and to watch everybody progress and watch myself change and my relationship with Aikido change over the years too.
Yeah. Beautiful. So actually, I'm thinking that we have some pictures in the background, and maybe you could also tell us a little bit about who we're seeing here in the background.
Sure. Yeah. Well, O-sensei was the founder of Aikido, who trained in many Japanese martial arts, and he never studied Aikido because Aikido didn't exist before he put these pieces of the puzzle together. He trained in Daitoru Jiu-Jitsu. He learned some Judo, some Kendo, and a lot of other martial arts. He spent some time in China and took the synthesis of his understanding of all of these components of martial arts, as well as spiritual philosophy from his spiritual trainings as well, and put together what he felt as something that he could convey to the few students that studied under him. After World War II, he reconsidered sort of some of the Japanese nationalism that led Japan into the situation of imperialism and in World War II, and he saw the destructive habits that come from nationalism and warfare. And when he was living in the countryside, he changed his relationship with his martial way and his teaching pretty dramatically. So you can study pre-war and post-war Aikido. You can find a lot online describing those differences. During that post-World War II training was one of the opportunities for Saito Sensei, Morihiro Saito Sensei, who lived in Iwama. I think he was 18 years old when he started training with O-sensei in the country dojo in Iwama. And there weren't a lot of students. I think this was even during the American occupation, where martial arts teaching and training was banned in Japan. And so Saito Sensei was there. He was ultimately given a portion of O-sensei's property there in his little country estate and built a house, started a family, and basically cared for the founder of Aikido up until his death. So he was very much a part of that. I'm not sure if it'll show up on the camera, but Saito Sensei is standing basically in front of the house and O-sensei's property where the dojo is. And right across the street and behind Saito Sensei is the jinja, the shrine to Aikido that O-sensei had built to sort of house the gods of Aikido. And it's still there in Iwama. You can go and visit. And right across the street from the jinja, the shrine, is the Saito family home, where his son Hitahira Sensei now lives, and he has a dojo in town as well. And then right next door is O-sensei's original dojo in Iwama too. So these were these were foundational elements of Aikido and Iwama style Aikido, and kind of the birthplace of the Aikido that we train in. He referred to it as Takimusu, which was Aikido that was sort of divinely inspired. You train at a level where you get to a place that the universe informs your technique. And so this is sort of the pinnacle of the Aikido practice, and where O-sensei ended up later in his life, where the techniques arrived in his body through training.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that background. And I think maybe as it was you were describing it, I felt like maybe we could unpack that, because people who are considering Aikido or are aware at some periphery in our contemporary modern world, I feel like it's important to have the full picture, which is somewhat rare as to the breadth or scope of Aikido in some ways. So one of the questions, back in the day, I did very briefly, I did Muay Thai, which is a very contact intensive kickboxing, body absorbing all the blows to the body and hardening off the body. And I did capoeira, which was a lot of trickery and playfulness as a dominant thread, and also music. And I feel like, as you were mentioning, spirituality has been sort of a thread, but very hidden. In Aikido, as you were also describing, that the shrine and the gods of Aikido, the founder O-sensei was a practitioner, among other things, the Shinto.
Amoto Kyo was the religious sect, cult, whatever, that he was very much a part of, and his teacher was very steeped in that spiritual tradition and religious tradition. And maybe the divide between religion and spirituality is important as well. There is and was Shintoism, Buddhism. Amoto Kyo was this weird amalgamation that was a different way to understand the religious underpinnings. And I can't really speak, again, like coming back to my comment about the expertise, I cannot speak as an expert in any of these things, because they're things that I've read about, but very cursorily. And again, in preparation for the interview, I was thinking, like, what sorts of expert advice or feedback can I give? And I was reminded, I think it was Václav Havel, the Czech writer, who said that one should follow those who seek the truth and run away from those who claim they found it. And as I was thinking through like responses that I might give you and to any questions you might have about my understanding of Aikido, I thought, wow, I don't know. I really don't know. I didn't know Saito Sensei, I didn't know O Sensei, and so I'm hesitant to speak as an expert in them. Like you said, there's a lot online that can be read.
Yes.
And a lot of the reading that I've done is through the eyes of trying to understand a little bit better the spiritual underpinnings that I certainly don't talk about much in the dojo, because I think that that's not the starting point for students' journeys, but it's very much a piece of the puzzle for sure.
Yes, and thank you for highlighting that. And I think my sort of inquiry is, I definitely recognize that, and I love the fact that you say I don't know is a perfect answer.
Yeah.
But just as perhaps as wide brushstrokes, because when I look at my own, it seems that a lot of martial arts coming from the East have this connection or groundedness, actually, or even perhaps origin in some kind of an spiritual monastery or a tradition.
Sure.
Often in the West, when we have what I've witnessed in martial arts, that's very rare. It becomes very disconnected. And one of the questions that came to me was which was the environment I was in. A lot of people were training in mixed martial arts. And the question that arose for me, I don't see Aikido there in that.
Yeah.
And in my exploration, maybe we could go into this. That's why I think it's important to highlight, perhaps maybe the intention is different, is that spiritual component is missing in that mixed martial arts movement. And it is not something that we're trying to introduce, but in fact, for most martial arts, that's the groundedness or origin.
Yeah.
And when that is restored back, then maybe mixed martial arts would not look like what it is today. So maybe in that context, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, I was reminded of something that O-sensei said, and maybe it predates him, this concept of masakatsu agatsu, which is the true victory is victory over oneself, that if you introduce competition into a martial art, then the victory, it's really difficult to maintain that element of that masakatsu agatsu, that true victory is like your own victory, the self victory, because you have a relationship with the other, and you have a relationship with domination or losing and winning. And as soon as that language is introduced into anything, then it becomes language of conflict, and even the language of conflict resolution. Like, it necessitates, there's first conflict, there's first this struggle to win and lose. And like you said, without any kind of spiritual underpinnings, you may get lost in that feeling of conflict. You may get lost in that feeling of, well, I have to keep going until I win. Even the question that comes up frequently in the dojo, either with new students or students that have been around for a while, or students that call or email and ask about the effectiveness of Aikido, or their desire to learn how to defend themselves, a self-defense class they might be looking for. And Iwama style Aikido especially, I think, has some strong underpinnings in terms of applicability, applied technique, and self-defensive techniques that are incredibly effective and could, in theory, achieve that feeling of victory over an enemy. But that's not the starting point. And to make those decisions without being conscious of yourself, I think it leads to a really destructive environment and a destructive world as well.
Yes. Yeah. So that I like how you said the effectiveness is what is the effect we're seeking. That actually came earlier through a conversation I was having with one of our mutual friends, Dorian. And the thought that came up was what is the effect of the martial art? And as you were saying, there is no opposition, there is no opponent per se in that way, and there is no competition. At least in the wider martial arts or mixed martial arts world, there is that competition and idea of winning and who climbs the ladder
first. And in a way, it's also a reflection of the paradigm that we're sort of living in, where nation states also exhibit the same traits, and we have wars and colonialism and all of that. So when that context is taken away, then Aikido seems to make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So when you see your students or people who come in, as you had begun to unpack this, what is the motivation, and do you see the motivation change over time?
Yeah, and everybody comes to Aikido for very different reasons, and some make that reasoning apparent. Some, the reason that they're there is unclear even to themselves, and so it's interesting to either have those conversations or witness it externally and see that sort of personal struggle with, why am I here? What am I doing here? What am I seeking in this? And for the most part, I do see that transition happen in students where they realize that they may have shown up because they wanted to feel more confident in a physical confrontation, or they witnessed a fight and they felt like they didn't have any way to intervene or be to set things right. But once they're on the mat for prolonged study of Aikido, you realize that the gains that you get aren't necessarily just that. It might be a byproduct. You might feel a little bit more confident in a physical confrontation. Not that you can win in every street fight or win in any street fight, but that you just might feel confident and calm. And that might be the desired impact or effect, instead of just win, right? Compete, win. Or in a mixed martial arts setting, compete, win. The other person gave up, or you made them submit, or whatever. It's a very different relationship.
Yeah. I think there is a lot of deep wisdom in that, because when we seek whether life or a martial art, and if the object is just to win, eventually it seems time and time again, and there are just numerous examples that even when you look at people who have won in that sense, not just in martial arts, but just anywhere, there is life is not fulfilled, and often leads to destructive behaviors and destruction for the overall society or civilization. I, for myself, never quite knew, as I was sharing, why I was doing martial arts, that it was an invisible force that brought me there, an attraction. And I think coming to Aikido has resulted in a new layer of articulation of that. It's still invisible, but not totally. There is a deeper resonance and more articulate. So maybe to punctuate that, and we can go into some of your experience. For me, Aikido is part being almost like in a Zen monastery, and part the physical training. And they don't separate. So, and I don't know if everybody who steps in the dojo has that expectation that there is this Zen monastery aspect to it.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I mean, that's something you'll have to interview each and every one of them and find out what their personal experience of the dojo space is. And a lot of times, in terms of a spiritual study, there's reference to a retreat. You go on a spiritual retreat, you go on a meditation retreat, or you retreat. I mean, you go away from whatever is happening. And for me, Aikido practice isn't a retreat. It's an entry. Like you don't retreat from the world when you step into the dojo. It's like, this is, you finally get to dive in. When we go to a seminar, you're not going to a seminar to retreat from anything. You're going there to dive in deeply. And maybe that happens in spiritual retreats too. Maybe it's just the language is incorrect. But I think a lot of times the spiritual retreat, you go away and you gain enlightenment, and there you found your spiritual center until you get stuck in traffic again. And the that's not the kind of enlightenment that I want Aikido to build towards. I want it to build towards, and I don't think any other spiritual pursuit is trying to build towards that either. But I want the Aikido practice to build towards a feeling of groundedness when somebody grabs hold of you and you're still centered. When someone swings a bokken at you and you're still centered. When there's movement and seeming chaos around you and you're still centered. And that's what I mean about diving in. It's like you're diving into, it's controlled. The dojo environment is very controlled. It's very safe. But especially to a brand new student, where there's people falling down and getting back up and swinging sticks around and twirling around in circles, it feels very chaotic. So if you can find your center in the midst of that, then there's some hope that you'll still be able to hold on to your center when you're stuck in traffic, on your commute to the city or whatever it is that you're doing. If you can carry that feeling forward. And, what we do in the dojo, it mostly doesn't look dangerous because we're very careful and we're very safe, but there's hazard in it, just the right amount to keep us aware, to keep us conscious. So yes, it is a Zen retreat in some ways. You come in here and you're in this sacred and safe space, but hopefully nobody's swinging a stick at your head when you go to a Zen monastery and you get to sit in silent meditation. It's a different experience, hopefully. Although I hear that some Japanese Zen monasteries, there is actually somebody swinging a stick at your head to help you gain enlightenment. But this is a little different practice than that.
Yeah. Just to quickly say that earlier you mentioned the word bokken, which means the wooden sword that we actually, I don't know if you're seeing here in the frame.
There's probably some behind me.
Yeah. But the picture will come in the post recording. So the weapons that we use in Aikido, and this is an excellent theme because I think it highlights what the application of Aikido is. And as you were highlighting, in spiritual schools, should I say, if you follow them in a non-dogmatic way, there are many schools of thought, and there is, at least I faced this part in my journey where it was about transcending, and partly it was because life was too painful, and in hindsight it was because I was not equipped to deal with that, and it seemed like spirituality was a tangent from that aspect, and it's sort of a pessimistic view of life on Earth, you could say, and we just transcend into the ecstasy, so to speak, or a nice escape from this into the transcendent. But later on, that has become a choice, but also a revelation that, in fact, there is a return, and it has to be integrated here, whatever understanding that you might have. And Aikido embodies that beautifully. All of those principles are repetitively, as you were saying, are being brought into the physical domain and then have application in our day-to-day life.
Yeah. And coming back to your first comment about the bokken and the jo, the weapons that we train with in Aikido, they're wooden weapons, and so they lack the sharp edge of a katana or a sword, but they hand us the hazard that we carry with us all the time that we're not necessarily aware of. Our impact on the world around us is pretty profound, whether we take note of it or not. To pick up a sword is a concrete reminder that you can have an impact on the world around you, and it might not be a good one. It can be devastating. A sharp sword will cut, and especially if you're unaware of the edge, it can do great harm to the world around you. And we do this silently, quietly, invisibly, with complete lack of awareness of the harm that we might be causing in the world. And to pick up the sword in the dojo is a physical reminder that our influence extends beyond our physical body, and maybe even extends beyond our intention if we move in a way without any level of awareness. So the practice with the sword and the jo, the staff, is difficult to integrate into the core teachings of the taijutsu, or the body art of Aikido, for beginning students. And it's usually quite an in-depth study before students start to realize that when they pick up the bokken, when they pick up the jo, when they're training empty-handed with their partner, it's all a part of the Aikido package that O-sensei and Saito-sensei really had to hand over to all of us, that we need those reminders that we're not limited. Our impact isn't limited, for better or worse. Our impact isn't limited by our physical body.
Yeah, I like how you highlighted, you were giving the example, actually, I was having the same thought simultaneously of some in Zen monasteries, they have the stick.
Sure.
And you're falling asleep, you get whacked.
Yeah.
And that, I think that highlights that we in Aikido, there is alertness is maintained because of just enough pressure that this can be a real situation, or ideally perhaps one should be assuming it to be a simulation of a real situation.
Yeah.
So, and constantly in class we have this awareness of breath, which is a huge thing, and maybe you have much to say about that. I feel like I keep returning to the breath with much more ease and becoming aware of what sort of the regulation of my nervous system is. Am I centered, relaxed in that conflict? And often I'm shocked at, even though this being a simulation and being training with people that are friendly and become friends, I found how much off center I get, and then re-regulating the breath. And now there's so much information about that the breath, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system is regulated by how we breathe, how fast we breathe.
And so much of that, I'm sure, just in your own experience, your personal experience and study of either seated meditation or moving meditation too, there's so much focus on the breath. And it's difficult enough when you're sitting perfectly still in a quiet room without any distraction to find that focus and relaxation on breath. And like you said, in the dojo, trying to have that same relationship that's a challenge to have in quiet, controlled environment without motion, to then also expect our entire body to find that same link to the breath as we're moving, as our partner's moving, and as everyone in the room is moving around us too, and still have that same focus on the breath. If we can make it happen, then we can breathe consciously in any aspect of our lives. If we can maintain conscious control of our breathing, or at least awareness of our breathing in that sort of chaotic environment, all these other places become a lot easier to maintain that relationship.
Yes, I mean, just a sheer amount of information that's now become scientifically validated around breath, although in most ancient cultures that seems to, even the word spirit, actually the etymology of the word spirit is breath. So it's not that it was unknown, but in our contemporary society we want a certain kind of evidence, and now that evidence is being provided as to what they call HRV, or heart rate variability, where the beats of your heart are completely regulated by how you're breathing. And that has impact on heart attack to strokes and just your levels of happiness. And I feel that for me, being a meditator, Aikido it provides that stress that I can't seem to forget. Or that reminder keeps coming back in class or during training. It's connected with the weapon and with the hand-to-hand combat. And to be honest, there is something mysterious about it, because I can't figure out why is it that I'm reminded so much. Not that you're reminding me, but that reminding of centering keeps coming, or that awareness repeatedly of, oh wow, I'm really off center. And that's what makes me nervous at times, not the opponent.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, you mentioned, I think you mentioned specifically the effects on happiness, right? Of just breath, the relationship between breath and happiness. And there's this, I mentioned when we met the other day, this two-way reflection of internal and external, that Sensei said the body teaches the mind, and the spirit, it really, the movements inform our spiritual experience and our emotional experience and our mental experience. And I think that a lot of a lot of studies of martial arts, of philosophy, of spirituality start with the intellect, start with the written word, and take that and then try to move towards the body, the effects on the body. It's just it's different for me to conceive of the street going both ways. That if I smile, I can actually change my emotional reality. My physiological response to my body smiling has an impact.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm happy emotionally, mentally, I'm thinking of something amusing or pleasing, my body responds externally and I smile. But that relationship between my body informing in the other direction, we don't put enough emphasis on. I think that it's always just like, oh, I need to be happy. And if I'm happy, then I'll look like this, or I'll act like this, or I'll feel like this. But it can be achieved the other way too. The way that we position ourselves affects our spirit, affects our emotion, affects our mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's such a deep point, and it's pretty amazing that through your own practice and refinement, you have this insight and emphasis on moving this way. It just brought to me a recent. I'm finding a lot of parallels between my study of what they call like the tantric traditions. It could be the Tibetan Buddhist tantras, or another tradition is the Kashmir Shaivism tantras. And tantra by itself highlights this sort of union of the dichotomy of the external and the internal.
Mm-hmm.
And often we hear this phrase of form is emptiness and emptiness is form, right? And it hints at that.
Yeah.
And more, what I'm finding as a practitioner is that this separation between what is external and what is internal, as considering the internal as sacred because it's subtle and invisible, is completely artificial, because the internal is in fact reflecting as the external.
Mm-hmm.
In science, we have all this, particles and matter, but even in that study, ultimately, the particles merge into the vacuum and spontaneously emerge from this quantum mechanical vacuum. So it confuses, because you can't really have a solid ground of, oh, there are particles and then everything comes out of those.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to segue. An example that came to me as a meditation was that in this retreat, in this Tibetic Tantric retreat, they were talking about how there is so much research on sun exposure and sunlight exposure in our sleep and our emotions. So early sunlight exposure is a big thing these days in the performance enhancement / science.
Mm-hmm.
And this Tibetan teacher is into that. And he said, well, and then we did a meditation, which was with your eyes closed, you're visualizing the colors of the rainbow and you internalize these lights. And they've been doing this for nearly 22,000 years. And they're in their highest understanding, the external light and the internalization of these lights are not separate. They're the same sort of light.
Yeah.
But without digressing too much, I felt like that Aikido embodies that at a very high level.
Yeah.
That same teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really does. That internal external divide is not a divide. We are one being. And whether we call it separate pieces or not, calling it separate pieces doesn't serve us, because it does set up this relationship between the internal and external. And whether we call it mind or spirit, body, the physical, setting them as separate things means that we assume that they don't relate. We can have a spiritual experience that is based solely on the intellect and the spirit and ignores the body. Well, how? We're going to inhabit our body hopefully for quite some time until we're done with it, mm-hmm. and maybe transcend and go live in bliss. But in the meantime, we inhabit our body. Our mind and spirit inhabit our body, or they are combined with our body. And so in the physical practice of Aikido, it is exactly that. It's like the primacy of the physicality is the biggest part of what always has brought me back and continues to bring me back to Aikido.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't enter into the dojo to have a spiritual experience. I don't enter into the dojo to think about Aikido. Even when I'm having a conversation about it, you've seen me teach now for over a year, and I don't talk much about Aikido. I try not to, at least. And every time I catch myself talking about Aikido, I'm like, quit it. That's not it. The words are not going to communicate whatever the lesson is, and I'm not going to communicate what the lesson is. Your body is going to communicate the lesson of Aikido to your mind and spirit. That's what's happening. For me, at least, that's what's happening. That I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not even teaching you what to do. I'm showing your body the shape that it could make so that it can inform your mind and spirit. And that's what happens to me, at least. And then, again, just speaking from my own experience, this has been my experience of my learning of Aikido. That the physicality of the training is what teaches me. That's where I really learn Aikido, is in my body.
Yeah. Yeah, and just as a connection to the earlier spiritual conversation we were having, which we wanted to ground this more in the physicality, the sensei had a realization at some point, being, as you were saying, a practitioner of multiple martial arts and different spiritual traditions over his lifetime, and these movements that are in Aikido, which I know very little about, to be honest, but I do understand that they came to him as a divine revelation of sorts. And not just the movements, but also an important component, which is Kiai, the breath, and the sounds that are made.
Mm-hmm.
And this, to me, makes perfect sense, because when we look at the wider culture, we have yoga and Qigong, Tai Chi, and that is the narrative there as well as to the essence of these movements.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, Aikido, when you are showing us a form or a movement, it has that application just like a yoga posture.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that upscales or up-levels Aikido as a purificatory process and a process of embodying the vessel that we have been given.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where, to me, the only intellectual practice, the thoughtfulness that might come, is, I referred to it in class today as this physical imagination. What does it feel like for you to imagine your own body adopting the same posture? And there's some benefit to thinking through the Aikido postures, the Aikido techniques, the movement with a partner. There's some benefit even to trying to make the movements on your own without a partner. The real learning happens when you get to put your intellectualizing about it to the test and actually try to move your training partner. But to me, even trying to imagine the technique, it's not an intellectual exercise. I'm trying to get my body's wisdom to take on that imaginative component. What would my body feel like to stand in this way, to stand in Hanmi, to move quickly, to be balanced or unbalanced, to sort of find that center point between flexibility and strength and balance and coordination, to put those four components together in my own body. What would that feel like? And to tap into that, I don't know what else to call it other than that physical imagination. Usually we think about imaginative as like, visualization, right? What does it look like? And then it's a visual experience. And that's one way to do it. You can visualize yourself in that position. You can visualize the technique happening, visualize your partner. But it's not just visual. And in fact, I think it's better for it not to be visual, but for it to be physical. The entirety of the body is experiencing that imaginative experience of the technique. And then someone grabs hold of you and you see whether your physical reality matches your physical imagination or not.
Yeah, I love what you said. I think that there's a word called embodiment, and there's the opposite of that is disembodied, which often refers to like spirits and ghosts, and stuff like that. And as I've been practicing Aikido, and I think we've spoken about this earlier, what I've felt is to begin to notice within myself and in fellow practitioners, what is the level of embodiment, which to me means I actually don't know the certain back behind me, or I don't know how to use, I don't even know where my toe was placed or how it was placed. And it's important because with a lot of the Aikido techniques, I feel like they're magical, because the moment something adjusts or is done in the right way, a powerful torque or spin or a lever function or gear function is unveiled, which makes things just work. So I continuously find, I haven't actually embodied all the fingers of my hand or my shoulder joint. And I love that, because when I work on my computer or I'm walking in the street, I am walking, in fact, disembodied. So maybe that is for the time when I actually become disembodied. But right now I am embodied, so I should know. Just like we drive a car, it's if you have a powerful machine, I think it makes sense to read the user manual a bit and know what the car will do at 80 miles versus 120 miles.
It's interesting, the link to the car as well. And I think that in some ways functions the same way that the Boken functions, that hazard of being that we carry around with us, that we're not even aware of the danger to the world that we might bring. A car, absolutely. It's like way more dangerous than a sword. The reach of a sword is a few feet. The reach of a car at 80, 100 miles an hour, it has a profound impact on the world around us. And that awareness that we have in the dojo about the impact that we might have extends maybe to the edges of our physical body. We pick up a boken, it extends, maybe our awareness extends to the edges of, or the end of the sword or the end of the jo. But in a car, it extends, or should hopefully extend to the edges of the car, and also forward through time, like where the car may end up. This is a level of physical awareness that a good driver will hopefully, it would be great if all drivers carried this level of awareness with them. I think very few do. And like you said, most of us move through the world in a fairly disembodied way without holding in our physical imagination what impact we might have on the world around us, even physical impact. It's the car is a good metaphor for that.
Yes, and I have to say, this is as you just highlighted certain things that we could actually enter. This is such a deep topic, actually, of how embodied we are and how aware we are of the sort of these circles, concentric circles of our impact after the next person versus the whole town. And another thing that comes to mind is, because of our roles in life and what we do, we might have only learned to walk versus deploy all of our what the potential of this vessel is to do.
And like you said, it's not we have to focus on the self and the center, and then we have to focus on the other, and then we have to focus on family or community, and then we have to focus on humanity and the universe, and then we have to cycle back to the center of that circle again, figure out, am I still in my body or not? And then once I move from self to other, once I move from other to family and community to humanity to the universe, is the center still hold? So that ebb and flow back and forth, and those ripples back and forth to the center and back out broader, I think is a really important piece to test on the mat, off the mat, every time you wake up and interact with the world around you, to find self, other, community, family, humanity. I think it's important to ride that wave in and out both, right? That tide, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is different from that competitive sort of paradigm that we are in, which gets focused in certain sports even, where it's all of, the focal point of the center is all about me and less about what happens to anything else. And one reflection of that in Aikido is that you don't really have an opponent, which I find very beautiful, actually heightens your awareness, is that you have a sort of a responsibility for what happens to what would seemingly be your opponent, the one who is attacking. And not only are you responsible for what are the consequences of your actions to yourself, but also to the other. So I haven't seen any martial arts where that responsibility of another body is also given to you. Usually it's okay. It's either you or me standing, and it could end up in a concussion or somebody in a knockout account where you've been knocked out.
And externally, Aikido can look like that. And I mean, you've certainly seen examples of techniques that from an outside perspective would be difficult to reconcile with the internet's version of Aikido as the art of peace. When you see me or anybody else in the dojo or in our Aikido community perform a technique, and you think, okay, how would I explain to somebody who's only read about the spiritual teachings of Sensei and the beautiful, peaceful art of Aikido and the way to reconcile the world, but then you watch what looks to be this devastating Atemi nage or something, where the uke flies through the air and lands seemingly really hard on the ground. And it's difficult to externally say, this is what is happening. This is how it is not destructive and devastating. And the only way that you can have that experience is to be both the uke and the nage in the middle of that technique, to feel the technique. And then you can have that relationship with the movement as one of peace and care and compassion and love. And both people in the situation walk away from it feeling better. Like I'm always hopeful that at the end of Aikido, at the end of Keiko, when we practice here, that everybody walks out feeling better than when they walked in, rather than feeling broken, destroyed, injured, or defeated or anything else. So it's an interesting piece to reconcile, that idea of Aikido being perceived, and rightfully so, as nonviolent, but then watching the techniques unfold and thinking, whoa, how is that nonviolent? How is that peaceful? And it's only in feeling that you can really grasp.
Yeah. I think there are a few pathways we could take here. I did want to come to this idea of feeling that you were saying, but a related thread of what you just described with the car analogy, and then with the uke and nage, which is the two practitioners, one who's receiving the technique versus one who's attacking, is this idea of that living in the world to do our best, we have to become aware of our sort of blind spots and shadows, so to speak, of assuming that each one of us has the capacity to do harm or wrong. And only that by knowing that aspect of ourself, exposing that aspect of ourself, do we ultimately have the capacity of making the not correct, but right choices. Well, of course, we constantly fail at that. I somehow feel that Sensei's life highlights that aspect, rather than considering him, he's a realized being or some idea of perfection. But instead, that we always have this capacity, especially as we become developed as a martial artist or go from a motorcycle to a car, our choices can have a maximum impact either way. Mm-hmm. Do you resonate with this, that first of all, that we always have this capacity of darkness or shadow? And secondly, is it important as martial artists, to expose this so that we can make informed choices?
I think, yeah, absolutely. It's important to recognize our capacity for, as you said, darkness and shadow. And in our Aikido practice, we get to feel that. And when we play the role of the attacker, we get to experiment with that feeling of ferocity and intensity, and not violence, but meanness to a certain, it's play acting to a certain extent, right? But we want to have the same feeling. And then we get to feel, how do we respond to that? What does that trigger in me? And does it bring out that darkness or that violent tendency when I feel threatened? Do I become tense and angry too? Right? And then we get to explore it and understand it. And only through understanding can we move through it. Only through understanding can we move to a place where it's not just you're either violent or you're powerless and peaceful. The conflation of pacifism with powerlessness, I think, does not fit with Aikido practice and does not fit with reality. To be a pacifist is not to be powerless. And an Aikido practitioner can get to a place of feeling empowered, and through that empowerment become the pacifist that powerlessness doesn't give you. It's a difficult equation, I think.
Yeah. A short story of O-sensei is coming to my mind that I was just maybe resonates with what you just shared. That he was challenged by someone in his life. It seems like many people challenged him, and as he was challenged, as the samurais have the tradition of bowing to each other before the fight. The one who challenged, the challenger, bowed, but O-sensei did not bow. And after quite some time, so people started to murmur, this is disrespectful or is against the tradition or whatever. And then once the opponent was done, at some point O-sensei bowed, and the opponent conceded that he had lost. And do you know the story?
No.
Okay, and the reason, maybe there are different versions of the story, but the reason that O-sensei did not bow is that he sensed the intention of the opponent that he wanted to strike when he was bowing. And actually later when the opponent conceded, he acknowledged that I have conceded because he sensed my intention, because I wanted to strike him when he was bowing. And only when that intention had cleared out of my heart and mind that he bowed. So he had already won without actually a fight taking place.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Yeah,
just that level of awareness.
That level of awareness.
Yeah.
And so it seems that when we have a higher level of awareness, we know perhaps at a felt level and a deeper level, the consequences of our actions. And then it becomes unnecessary to do that damage. Perhaps it also means that when we in fact do damage, like kill someone or injure, it is in fact in ignorance, and we don't really know what the long-term or even short-term consequences of our actions are on ourselves and on others. Which I don't know. I think our civilization is an example of that. We try to fix things, and apparently they keep getting more broken.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a global problem.
Yes. So you spoke of this idea of feeling, and I was wondering if you could say more about it. And maybe one of the ways that I've been feeling is getting, particularly when I'm the uke, which is half of Aikido, is what I've heard is receiving the technique. You're being thrown, and as an uke, you're taking the fall. And I have started to feel and sense more what the force vectors are within my body and where are they trying to guide me. Which to me is a very new sort of sensation of really trying to tune into the intelligence that already lies within the body, which is not in the mind. It's a different, as you were saying, a feeling sense.
Yeah.
could you unpack this word of what feeling is in this regard?
I think you gave a great example of that, like you said before, embodiment of your Aikido practice, where you're trying to let your body tell you where it needs to be, what it needs to do, what it should do in a particular situation. If a technique is twisting your arm in a particular way, if you have to take the time to decide what would save the joint from injury, it's probably going to be too late in an applied situation. If you have to decide that, oh, I should probably lean forward instead of leaning back to avoid injury, it's just too long of a route to get all the way into your mind, into your brain, to conceptualize what's the right action, and then bring it back into your body to then act. We have to bypass the thinking part of our Aikido practice. And then, to me, is where the feeling kicks in. You should move from a place that sort of bypasses the central nervous system in some ways and is just feeling like, of course I move this way. Of course I rolled this way. Of course I landed this way, because that's where the technique guided me. That's where my nage, person throwing, guided me. And that's where necessity guided me, to preserve my body, to preserve my extension, the feeling of my body. And then when you watch two people train together who operate at that level of feeling, that's when Aikido becomes what looks externally as this beautiful dance, because it's only flow. The fluidity of those two bodies moving together without intellectualizing. Then the technique can appear devastating. But the same way that if something is light enough in the wind can't ever touch it. Right? It pushes it before it can ever destroy it. And it's a higher level of training that is difficult to arrive at without coming from a false place of two people entering into the dojo thinking that they're supposed to dance and it's supposed to be beautiful first. And that's not it. That beauty of movement happens through profound feeling, profound embodiment. Then the techniques might become beautiful. But if you just enter into Aikido thinking oh, it's supposed to be beautiful and fluid, you never get to feel it. Everybody's always chasing beauty instead of chasing feeling.
It's an interesting balance, right? Because Aikido does look beautiful. I've seen, I actually once was doing some rolls, and my dad, who had never seen Aikido, he was just sitting in the yard and he saw that and spontaneously just said, wow, that was beautiful. And I didn't recognize that. And I was like, wow, yeah, Aikido is actually aesthetically very beautiful. And there is a deep connection between Aikido and other aesthetic art forms in the Japanese culture. Or maybe it's because the whole culture is beautiful, like tea ceremonies, calligraphy. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sometimes in the dojo, maybe not as much recently, but I'll talk about the brushstroke of a particular kanji, a calligraphy character, that the path of the brush is very important. The order of the strokes in Chinese and Japanese both, the order of the strokes of the brush are essential when you're learning to write in the language. That's what you learn, is what order, what direction, what weight you place into the brush. And sometimes in our movements in the dojo too, I'll show that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago how much Aikido is, to me, a gestural art, that the gestural is the origin of the movement, and that if you ignore the gesture and you just try to force through with the large, strong muscles in the body, that you lose track of that feeling, the nuanced feeling. So to have awareness of calligraphy, of a brush stroke, the importance of which order the strokes of a character arrive onto the page in, and the weight of the brush being very important, it absolutely translates into our Aikido practice too.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing because it points to how subtle it can be. But also, as you're saying, is that that subtlety is necessary to have the maximum or perform a technically correct way. Often in class, as a beginner, I'm learning how, when you're pointing at what my finger is doing or where my finger is pointing at and where it's going, and when I adjust that, it's surprising that actually is guiding, which in a way makes sense because we point at things.
Yeah.
Right. And but it's not the bigger muscles or the bigger parts of the body. It's that directionality comes from the subtle aspects. It's a new way to feel and use gesture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like you said, when you're first learning, it has to be the major muscles, or which foot's forward, things like that. No, raise your left hand. No, your other left hand this way. Oh, not that high. It has to be pared down to an accessible level. But then at a certain point, then it's not just have your left hand forward, but have your left hand forward in this feeling of kokyu. Use the muscles on the outside of the body, the outside of the arm. And then it looks and feels different. The gesture changes. That subtle gesture changes the entirety of the technique and the feeling. I had a student in class, we were doing a technique, and she was struggling with the throw. And it was that same thing. Well, just imagine the extension of the sword or your fingers pointing beyond, like pointing. Imagine your fingers pointing, it's not your hand, it's your hand pointing at something. And all of a sudden, she was able to move past where she was stuck and throw her partner. And that level of awareness that we don't have to shrink into ourselves, that we can expand well beyond ourselves with the gesture, like you said, the direction of the hand, the finger points, the blade of the hand. Even the gesture doesn't have to be pointing. Oftentimes our gaze is as profound, it has as profound an impact on the people around us as anything else. You look in a direction, you raise your gaze, you lower your gaze, you turn your head in a direction, and it has an impact on the people that are aware of that. Even out of their peripheral vision, people can find that your gaze has shifted, either away from something towards something. And maybe this is some innate survival mechanism that we have to be aware of our surroundings and we have to be aware of what other people might be looking at. And in Aikido, we exploit that, or at least emphasize it enough to move with awareness. So in Japanese, metsuge is the gaze, and we talk about our gaze being up and out from the body so that we're not shrinking. A person, you can watch their attention shrink back in as they dissociate, or like we talk about being glazed over expression. They've retreated, they've withdrawn, and they're no longer out. Right? So with gaze as well, with gesture as well, these are all ways that the practice of Aikido becomes a lot more complicated, because it's not just put your left foot forward and turn your hips counterclockwise or whatever. It's well beyond that. Still things that I think can be taught, or at least be observed and pointed to as this might be why it isn't working or doesn't feel right. But it's a much more difficult art. It's not the sort of thing that you go to a week-long seminar, learn Aikido, and then walk away thinking, yeah, okay, now I know Aikido. Maybe next week I'll learn kickboxing or something.
Yeah. Maybe it's a lifetime of practice. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely not a week. Several years, perhaps.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of words, like you said, Kokyu. Could you, and also maybe we can then talk about weapons a little bit. Could you describe what that word is?
Sure. Kokyu it translates several different ways, but it's the life breath of the universe is the most straightforward and as well as the most esoteric translation of it. Kokyu just means breath, really, but it's bigger than just breathing in, breathing out. And then the phrase Kokyu Ryoku is the power of the breath. And when we breathe in, we breathe out, it's not just our lungs, but the entirety of our body, that expansiveness of our body. So the feeling of Kokyu Ryoku, the power that our breath can lend to our physical body, it feels like extension or expansion beyond the physical limits of our body. So when we extend or expand our spirit, it takes up more space. It occupies more space than our physical body can possibly occupy. And this is how we start to impact and reach out to the people around us. We reach out through our breath, we reach out through our body, and we reach out then through our spirit as well. So that idea of Kokyu Ryoku is pretty key to the feeling that comes in Aikido.
Yeah, that's a fascinating subject because out of all the things, whether you're with your enemy or friend, you're always sharing breath.
Yeah.
If nothing else.
Yeah.
And you also talked about this idea of expansion, and in weapons, I found it pretty profound that I did not know when I started Aikido. It was like, it just seemed very cool to have weapons and train with them, but there's a one-to-one correspondence between taijutsu or hand-to-hand combat or practice with the weapons practice. There's almost no separation the more I'm exposed to it, and I'm still a beginner. Like you mentioned the idea of expansion, and I've often seen you highlight that normally when we use our body, we don't have this sense of what the boundary for our body is sort of contracted because it ends at the finger or the chest. But as we're using weapons, you highlight that instills in us that the expansion goes much further than the physical layer of the body.
Yeah, and it's very important to keep that larger circle in mind, so that when you're empty-handed, you don't shrink, right? You don't shrink back just because the bokken is put away, because the jo is put away. That expansiveness, kinobasu is the Japanese word for it. Right? That expansiveness should remain. And we train with the sword, we train with the jo, so that when we don't have them, we have the physical reminders in our body of what it felt like to occupy more space. And then we can try to expand to fill that sphere as well. That feeling of expansion is very important. The concept of the bokken, jo, and empty hand being connected is riai. Riai is something that Saito Sensei talked about a lot, and he would emphasize certain techniques where he would show that a movement with the bokken was the same as the movement empty hand. The movement with the jo, same as empty hand. And I've tried to really take that to heart in my teaching and find ways that I can link the empty-handed techniques back to movements that we might make with the sword, that we might make with the jo. So that when you are practicing on your own with the jo, practicing on your own with the bokken, you can still feel your partner is there with you. Right? You can move in a way that you moved when you were on the mat with the jo and say, yes, this was the same feeling, the same movement, the same centeredness and expansion both. And the bokken and jo can help with that.
You're speaking about centeredness. Could you say about what is the most physical level of the center, and what other subtle aspects of the center are there?
Well, in a lot of Japanese traditions, where we wear the dogi, the outfit that you wear when you're on the path, the knot on your belt represents your hara, or your center, your physical center. And so that knot on your belt is supposed to be the physical reminder of where your center should reside. And just in terms of my teaching and my observation of my students as they learn, and not just my students, but other instructors and other dojos and other people in the world that, not just in martial arts even, move through life. My visual sense of people through my Aikido practice and through teaching has changed a little bit in terms of that physicality of centeredness, of watching a person's center move through their body as their attitude changes, as their emotional state changes. I think there's a profound shift in the body, physically in the body, when we're under stress or sorrow or joy or anything else. And if we're distracted, overwhelmed, you just watched some tests on the mat the other night, part of the test, and there's nervousness, and that nervousness affects the center. And you can see it. I don't know if everybody can see it the way that the way that I think I do, watching that center shift through that, oh, there's an audience watching me, and all of a sudden I feel my center, like the tightness in my chest, or my center is up in my throat. And then the off balancing happens, whether it's literal off balancing or just feeling off balanced. But when I relax, when my shoulders are relaxed, when I'm in my body, when my breath is unified with my body, then my center drops back closer to the hara, where the knot on the belt resides, is that reminder, like where I should feel my center. The bend of my legs, the openness of my hips, the relaxation, and as many muscles as possible allows my center to fall where it should. And anything that I do, any tension, any emotional distraction, takes me out of that center, places that center elsewhere in my body, makes it more difficult to move. We move very efficiently, I think, when our center resides where it should. We move very inefficiently, clumsily, not like causing problems clumsy, but just we don't move in the same way when we don't have that centeredness.
Yes, thank you for breaking it down, because often it becomes a very nebulous idea. I remember somebody once speaking about the center in life, and saying that the center is when your thoughts, your feeling, and your body are in alignment. Now that you're thinking about something else and the body's doing something else, and the felt experience is in another direction. And I feel like some of the things that you touched at cover all of those, or all of them are here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sensei talked about the symbolism of the triangle, circle, and square in his spiritual practice. And there's plenty of reading you can do on those concepts. And we touched on sort of the square of flexibility and strength, coordination, and balance as sort of for me, these sort of corners of the square. But the square has a center, or should, right? And without awareness of that center, none of those 4 components of our learning matter.
So it was flexibility
and strength, balance, and coordination. We could be the best at any one of those 4 things. Even we could be the best at all 4 of those things. But without centeredness in the middle of the square, like they're meaningless. It's empty, right? The circles, those ripples of the self, the other, family, community, humanity, like without the individual, without the self, that sense of self and centeredness, it's nebulous. It falls apart. Not self-centered, not like I'm the most important or you're the most important, but that identity, I think, is really core. Literally, that centeredness is at the center of it, oddly enough. But the triangle, for me, it's the power, precision, and grace are sort of these other 3 components. The vertex of the triangle for me are that power, precision, and grace, where you can be powerful, or you can be graceful, or you could be both. You could be precise, or all 3. But without centeredness, they're meaningless and it's empty. So the center, I think, is incredibly important. We move from our center first and foremost, and we should.
Yeah, it also seems like when you say the center in this case of the square and the triangle, is some kind of a balance between all 3 rather than being polar in one direction.
Yeah, and plenty of martial arts will focus on one component over another. Plenty of martial arts practitioners will focus on one component over another, whether it's because that's their natural state or natural gift. A lot of times it's easier to be graceful if you're innately graceful, and so you may be drawn to grace, and downplay power and precision because they're more difficult, right? So maybe we just ignore those 2. But a balance between them all, I think that centeredness is key. A person who has innate grace in them maybe could benefit from being dragged toward exploration of power, dragged towards exploration of precision. And then through that exploration of those other components, maybe find their center and the balance in it.
Another very interesting concept in Aikido is Atemi, which, as you were saying, there's just enough pressure, and one of those pressure is demonstrating what is accessible as a martial attack in a certain opening or in a certain movement. And oftentimes, Atemi could also reflect a fake or a trick, sort of to guide, to do a setup of sorts.
I wonder about that. That's something that I'm not certain about, whether it would serve in that capacity. I think, and maybe this speaks to your training in capoeira.
Yeah, too, that element was very much there. And just before we go on to that, maybe you could describe to us what Atemi is.
Well, Atemi, it's a strike, like you said, and usually with a closed fist. But the strikes in Aikido practice, they don't land, and many of them certainly point towards weak spots in your partner, right? A spot where, you certainly would not want to be punched in the temple or the neck or the knee or the top of the foot, things like this. So I think that some of senseis practice, the Atemi component was just a point to, if you needed to soften your opponent's opposition to the technique up a little bit, striking here would do just that. So in some ways it's instructive in terms of, this is a way that a person who hasn't fallen down yet, whose balance hasn't been captured yet, can help facilitate that goal. The other thing that happens, and maybe I'll show this in Irimi Nage in particular, the strike at the hip or the back, the goal to me in most of the Atemi is to upset the balance. So it comes to this other Japanese concept, or maybe it's just in martial arts, kuzushi, the balance breaking, where a person's balance is taken usually by removing their shoulders from above their hips from above their ankles. The balance is broken, and then the technique can be much more gentle instead of having to apply force in the way that some judo throws might. But the Atemi is, I don't want to say it's not a feint or a fake, but definitely a distraction in a way that has an effect on the center and an effect on awareness. So when a fist is moving very quickly into your field of vision, our body reacts. And when our body reacts, it creates a different shape. And oftentimes it creates an uncenteredness. And so there's no need to strike a person if they believe they will be struck. And so the Atemi can serve in that regard. Like a fist coming quickly towards the face creates a response, and then the throw can happen. So it's, I don't know, we don't train punching in Aikido. We don't learn how to punch, and we don't toughen our fists up on bags of rice and punch concrete bricks and things like that. And the goal would never be to punch to injure, but the Atemi that you speak of is simply to set up the throw, the balance breaking, so the throw can happen in a way that doesn't destroy, that doesn't devastate.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I wanted to say is you have this interest in etymology and kanji, which is the calligraphy of Japanese, and you've already highlighted several words, including kazushi, riai, kinobasu. Is there any other, perhaps Aikido related, or your favorite words that you wanted to sort of dive in? And I say that in the context of that Aikido has a number of these principles, some of the ones that we have been dissecting, which is, I find something very unique about Aikido, where sometimes when I come to train, I'm setting this intention of revising some of the key principles as bookmarks so that I can check, how aware was I? What's the concentric circle? Was I aware of my partner and somebody else who could have stepped on my head? who were so. Am I aware of that, and am I expanded? Am I relaxed? So some of those key principles. Do you have anything that?
I don't know. Some of those will just come out spontaneously, and I'll do the research in the moment, and and try to share what information, my own understanding or misunderstanding. In the dojo, I have the advantage of hopefully everybody will forget everything that I say in class when they walk out the door. So even if I misspeak or misidentify a character or show something, when I'm being recorded, then you'll have to edit out any mistakes that I make about characters and meanings. The Aikido is a good starting point.
Yes.
And there's plenty of experts, the people that have actually studied Japanese calligraphy, and I haven't. People have actually studied Chinese etymology. These are all Chinese characters.
Yes.
In fact, the Japanese didn't have a writing system, and so they just borrowed, inherited their writing system from China. So these are all Chinese characters that I'm sure an actual etymologist could have much more to say about.
Yeah.
But the character I, which it translates as harmony, is the union. This is the number 1 in the middle. It's the union of the lid and the opening. This is the character for mouth or cave down below. So it's the lid that fits perfectly above the opening. So if you think about the jar with the lid that fits perfectly in the jar. So this concept of harmony is this idea of perfect fit. And when we train, we look for that feeling of harmony. When we move, we look for that feeling of harmony. It doesn't always happen, but that's obviously it's up right here on the shomen, so it's probably pretty important. It's the name of the art that sensei finally agreed would be the name of it. It wasn't his idea, I don't think.
And the shomen is this altar.
The shomen is the front of the front. So there's usually a little shrine of sorts at the front of the dojo. So that's the character for I. And then in Ki, in Japanese, they've simplified this and just made a little character, a little X down here to simplify so that it can be written more quickly. But the original Chinese has this character for rice in the middle of it. And then this is the steam coming off of the rice. The word Ki is the same as Chi, the same as prana. It's the spirit. But to me, I love the fact that this is the steam coming off of the rice, because the steam is not the rice, but the rice is important.
Yes.
Right? The steam wouldn't exist without it. So it's that disembodied component of spirit, but the rice is still there. So again, it's just a word for spirit. It's Qi in Chinese. But that character is not just a word. It's made up of these little, they're called radicals, the smaller characters. Do is the foot and the head, and it represents the movement on the path. And so most of the characters in Chinese and Japanese that reference movement will have this foot beneath them, because it's us walking along. And we use the word do to represent the path that we're on. The same character is used for Michi, is the other reading of the character. And it just means street or path. So you would reference, like, it's like lane or street, road, whatever. We would just use Michi in that regard. So it has a more profound sense when you refer to it as the path that we are on, as opposed to Aikijutsu, which would mean a collection of techniques. This is us on a journey. And usually when Do is used in this context, it's referring to a spiritual journey of sorts. More profound, a way to live life, rather than just something to study, learn, master, and move on.
I think this is a very powerful distinction to make between what you said, Do and Jitsu, right? Is that?
Jitsu, yeah.
Just technique versus the path. As a martial art practitioner, maybe you've already described this, but what is the clear sort of distinction? Maybe it's an easy one to make between these two.
Between a Jitsu and Do?
Yeah, and what would also be the difference in terms of its effect?
Well, for me, the difference between Aikijutsu and Aikido is that a jitsu would be confined by the walls of the dojo and check marks. It's like, have you learned this thing yet? Okay, check. We have testing requirements, so it kind of feels like that at some times, that you're just checking off the list of techniques you've learned. But for me, at least, it becomes a practice that when it leaves the dojo, when I find that there's application beyond the mat, well off the mat. And I'm sure that, every martial art, whether it's a jitsu or do, like there's some application off the mat. There's some lessons being taught that's beyond just the collection of techniques. It's not just checking boxes. Did you learn Ikkyo yet? Yeah, okay, check that. But the practice for me, and I think the practice for other people too in Aikido and martial arts that have that spiritual component, is that it goes well beyond the confines of the dojo, well off the mat as well.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction, because one could be just focused on jitsu, a collection of techniques from here, from there, but the path seems that journey itself is the fruition, rather than, I have these check boxes, I've gotten all these techniques down, and onwards I go.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to find that balance though, because it's not. If everybody that walked in the door, I introduced myself as their spiritual guide on their personal journey, that is not what I am. Like, I am not their spiritual guide on their personal journey. I am not taking them on the path. So, in some ways, I am just teaching a collection of techniques, but it is through the study of Aikido. The techniques that we're learning will maybe move some people in a particular direction, and it's me I'm working on. Everybody else is working on themselves. I'm not doing Aikido to other people. I am doing Aikido.
Yeah, I definitely feel from the limited arts that I have practiced that the Do aspect there is a structure that's provided, perhaps because of the spiritual things, and those structures can be invisible, but they sort of do provide sort of guidance if you so choose to embark on that. It's not too hidden.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's like when you do Muay Thai, it's at least here in the West, it's extremely violent.
Yeah.
And I only did one smoker fight with 200 people watching, and it was not apparent to me until I stepped in the ring that it's either me or him.
Yeah.
And I got so anxious / my nervous system became something else that I never experienced before. Actually, vomited right after the fight, just because of the state I got in, because that took me by surprise. Although it shouldn't have in that particular domain. Eventually, you get used to that, but that one was enough to stop that. Try to go do something else. Seek a different effect. Okay, so another word that seems very central is Kiai. Could you dissect that word for us?
Sure. It's written with the same characters as Aiki, right? So Kiai is the way to get the spirit harmonized. We vocalize. I do. My students don't so much, but we try to vocalize with this feeling, and it's translated Kiai. The word Kiai is usually translated as combative shout, but the characters know there's no shout in the characters, and there's no combat in the characters either. It's a way to get our spirit unified with breath. We can't make noise without breathing. I mean, we can, but our voice requires breath. And so when we breathe out at the proper time, we have expansion in our body, the physicality of it as well. And we unite our breath and our movement, then that Kiai is felt more profoundly. So this idea that we can Kiai in certain situations to create an impact both on ourselves and our training partner. Not just the sound, but the physical reaction as well. We create a physical reaction in our partner. We create a physical reaction in ourselves. And the expansion of our spirit really comes as a result of that.
This probably is a deep theme, but in my own practice, that's something that I'm perhaps now emphasizing more. I mean, I feel like your Kiai is very powerful uh, and beautiful in the sense that when I'm on the mat and when I see your demonstration, it immediately brings the seriousness or sort of reverence, you could say, and also the intentionality, the martial intentionality, which can oftentimes, I think, can become sloppy without the Kiai. So I'm like, okay, I find in myself also resistance at times in a way to express that Kiai. And what I see that as a practitioner is that as a blockage of that embodiment that we have been speaking of, not at the level of voice, but in the full movement. And so there is this balance of like, how much should I push where it should be natural?
Right. And if it's not natural, I think part of at least my hesitation when I was trying to get comfortable with Kiai early on, it's not something that we have any practice in. It's not something that we do. And especially if we are introverted or calm by nature or gentle people, we hopefully aren't running around in the world shouting a whole bunch. I think that's a good goal to have as a human in the world, that you don't achieve your goals by shouting at people. So it's difficult to overcome that relationship with the vocalization of the Kiai. That if you suddenly just start shouting at people on the mat and knocking them to the ground, like, it seems both rude and violent. And like, how is this reconciliation? How is this getting at the core of spiritual harmony when I shout and knock you down? Like, but it is, if you can get to that place of authenticity, of voice and spirit and expansion and connection with your partner, yes, your partner will fall to the ground. Yes, your Kiai will have had an effect on them physically and possibly spiritually as well, as they fly through the air or fall over. But they, at least in my experience, like, you and your partner in this trusting relationship, nobody feels devastated or defeated or destroyed in these moments. It's not, and maybe you can speak more as the uke on the receiving side of that, what your feeling is of it. But the hope is that that's not the feeling in the uke's body or their ears, right? That combative shout isn't one of, like, doesn't incite terror, and you don't wet your pants and fall to the ground out of fear. That's not the goal of it, right? It's just, the goal is to envelop the person in sound and spirit, so that we become one person. And part of that is to, like, draw them into the physical reality of our bodies together in the technique. And the Kiai, like, triggers a few other senses along the way to draw all of their entirety into the technique.
Yeah, what a subtle and nuanced topic, really, in terms of its depth. When I'm on the mat, usually when I'm hearing your Kiai, it's very actually energizing. It brings a certain alertness and seriousness, because I might come from a long day at work, and it brings that focus.
Yeah.
And on the when we're training, each person's Kiai is different, and it communicates something, perhaps more than words do. In a very short amount of time. Your intent, is it friendly? Is it? I haven't seen any violent one, although I know that apparently now we have sonar weapons that are used
using
to
sound.
Yeah. And this perhaps also, maybe as you were saying, the lighter brushstrokes of Aikido's spiritual lineage, as to the mantric component of Kiai and some of these words that actually you have highlighted, Kinobasu and Masagatsu Agatsu. The word they used in Aikido is Tokodama, which, in my very superficial exploration, connects with mantras. or many parallels there. And and this is a whole separate conversation, because mantras, I think the culture understands that they have some kind of deeper significance.
Yeah.
And
that spiritual impact, right, of just the intonation is definitely there. And I think that, like you pointed out too, it's also the human voice is so revealing, and it's vulnerable to sing for the first time in front of a person, if you've never sung, if you're not a singer, is very vulnerable. It's difficult for people that aren't singers to use their singing voice in a way that others might hear it. Even a person that sings in the shower or sings beautifully might never want anyone else to hear it, because it's a vulnerability. And the Kiai is that same vulnerability, because it's revealing, right? It shares a piece of you that you might not even be comfortable with in yourself. And I think you mentioned the other day too that, physical contact is the same thing. You meet someone, you say hello, you get to know them. You might have a friendship with them that lasts years. You might understand them very deeply and profoundly and on lots of different levels. On the mat, someone grabs hold of you, you understand them in a very different way, very, very quickly. Not that it necessarily reveals everything about them, but all of a sudden we have a physical connection. You struck towards a person, you pinned the person to the ground, you were pinned by them. It creates a very different relationship right off the bat. And voice is absolutely another component of that. Like you said, if you hear someone's Kiai, it reveals something about them. It reveals something about their spirit that maybe they weren't ready to share. And that might be part of their hesitation, or maybe their hesitation is what's revealed when you hear their voice. So I think that our voice and the sounds that we internalize and share with the world definitely impact people's perceptions, and in our Aikido practice, they affect our physical reality as well.
Yeah. I just something came to me is I don't know if it's true or not. In Norse mythology or Vikings, it said that when before going to battle, they had these very aggressive battle cries that would already devastate the morale of the opposing force.
Yeah.
But maybe to briefly touch on this subject and trying to like wrap and close, because we're I hope that you're still game on. So the essence of a martial artist, because I feel like as a martial artist, someone who has done anything for that matter, but in the arts, but in the martial arts for a long time, is cultivating an essence. At least that's what I find in myself and practitioners who have done it for a long time. And as you were hinting with the Kiai, and not just the Kiai, but the interaction of a hand grab or a shoulder grab, Aikido does get very intimate.
Yeah.
Similar to tango sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So there is that intimacy. We had this conversation earlier of how much more I'm learning it communicates about the other person. And also with this recognition comes the opportunity to notice that briskly, or without spending 10 years of friendship, what is this person offering? And also, what is my response to that?
Mm-hmm.
Not to sound arrogant, but sometimes if I feel like somebody is being absent-minded, or is doing what to me seems like choreography of a jitsu or technique before I've done any application, I've started to take more responsibility for what's the best way to reestablish the center or bring the awareness back without me feeling disappointed, which was my first response.
Yeah.
Right. This is a waste of my time where I'm not learning anything. To reestablish that without, giving the other a responsibility, but taking the responsibility as a collective. But there are so many nuanced layers of that. But it is so powerful to me to notice someone's kindness, their demand to experience a certain level of force or not experience thereof, and how playful they are. And the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
So I find that it's a tremendous gift to receive that and just notice, oh wow, this individual has cultivated this over their lifetime.
Yeah. It's exciting to find people like that, and also like you're finding too to realize, I talked about Kinobasu, the expansion of spirit, and realize that oftentimes ego is really either close behind spirit or sometimes well out ahead of our expansion of spirit. And so some of these reactions are ego reactions of like competition or, oh, you're not doing it right, or we're distracted or whatever. And talk about a psychological experiment of trying to figure out, what do I do in this situation, especially a new student or someone with a year of experience or 2 years of experience or 20 years of experience, and just trying to ride this fine line of, what part of this is my ego involved? Am I reacting? Am I just trying to do the technique? There's so much, because it is you and your training partner doing Aikido together. The two of you together create 100% of the technique, or sometimes the two of you together maybe create 20% of the technique, and you have to build in the rest of it. And then through experience, we can take a different role in that. And if we can find our center and find the core of the movement, and we can move in a gracious way, then we can include our partner in the technique. And we might have to do 90% because they're distracted or disconnected or disembodied or whatever. And maybe through that physical experience, their body also is learning. And then next time it's 80-20, and then 50-50, where the two of us together create the entirety of the technique. So it happens in a lot of different ways, and it's different with every person. I'm sure you're finding, every person that you train with is a different physical experience and spiritual experience too.
It is. Yeah, and thank you for saying that last sentence. I think connecting it back to the earlier point of something that you had said at the beginning of this conversation, is you said you're not seeking out spiritual experiences when you go to train Aikido, and you had said that it was the physicality as a teacher and as a practitioner that has been important to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we connected that with this age-old adage of form is emptiness and emptiness is form. But coming back to something I've noticed is that in this receiving of your partner's essence, so to speak, whatever the distraction could be that, or love or joy, playfulness, there is a very fast learning of copying that at a subconscious level, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I had to learn that in a different way, I don't know, go to improv theater, or so I feel like that has been a gift as well. To often one has to be open to a certain kind of thing, but for me, one thing that has touched me is taking care of another. When I have been taken care of in a technique, and it's become very obvious that there is that martial aspect and seriousness, and this person has the capacity as an advanced practitioner to destroy, and they have taught me something while keeping me protected. That's a very touching experience that I repeatedly find in Aikido. And when I've in Aikido in particular, when I do not experience that, which has only happened very few times, the thing that has come in me is caution, and that I should not train with this person. Particularly, it's happened when I don't know in a workshop environment. Has rarely happened. Was like train with someone else. Because they know a lot more, but I felt that security was not there. I was like, I will get hurt here.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I've definitely trained with people like that, and it can be its own teaching tool, that moment of discomfort. And I've definitely trained with people that ride that edge of safety. And there've been times where I thought, oh, the only reason I'm okay is because of my ukemi. The way I received the technique kept me safe. And the hope is that person that you're training with was attentive enough to my ability to receive the technique that they could put in all of that power and strength and I don't want to say disregard for my safety, but if a training partner has complete disregard for my safety and complete lack of awareness of whether I can keep myself safe or not, it's not a good, it's a recipe for disaster, really.
Right.
Someone's going to end up hurt.
Yeah.
And I don't want to constantly have to be scrambling around trying desperately to keep myself safe from that other person. It's not necessarily what the emphasis in my Aikido practice should be.
To remain safe, or
to be scared about my own safety.
Right.
It's a difficult place to learn from, to be always on edge about how hurt I'm about to become. Yeah. It can be a really good teaching tool if you survive that experience. You might walk away from it going, oh, okay, I made it out alive only because of these skills that I had or quickly picked up.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a good way to train for me.
I noticed in one of the teachers, Pete Sensei, you mentioned some teachers have a different emphasis. I feel like what's unique, or one of the emphasis that I've seen in him that I get corrected a lot on, is this knee that you just left out there. These things can actually happen. And I'm very grateful for that. I was like, whoa.
The potential for injury.
The potential for injury is like broken knee.
Yeah.
Dislocated joint. So, but that brings that alertness and awareness that I feel in absence of it, I don't know how you would even adjust. And often we do very powerful techniques and they become more clear when you know why it's being done that way. So what is, for you, what is the essence you feel like you have cultivated or are continuing to cultivate, or perhaps has changed over time? Any way you want to take this?
The essence of my Aikido practice? I'm not sure. I mean, I think that just coming back to this idea of inhabiting my physical body and the lessons that the physicality of my Aikido practice have to teach me, it keeps me plugged in to the training, to the teaching. My students have become my teachers. Without me going to a dojo and training with a sensei that is my teacher, my students have very much become my teachers. And now my experience of my physical body and my physical interaction in class, in teaching and showing, and then in watching the mirror that you all hold up to me is really profoundly instructive for my practice as well. I get to see through the embodiment of my teaching and my students what I need to work on too. Right? So it's that physical impact, not the physical, but it's the impact of the physical on my emotional and mental, spiritual well-being that it keeps me going.
Well, also thank you for creating this environment. As a student, I can say that it's benefited my life in more ways that I can imagine. I've come here on many days, and always, as you were saying, I think every time I've left the dojo feeling great.
Yeah.
And I always use that as a reminder on days where I feel like, oh, I just don't have it in me to show up today. It's like, oh, remember each time I always feel rejuvenated and renewed after training. So thank you for that. And I feel like you embody so many of the principles that O-sensei states, which should be the culmination of this practice. And that gives confidence in Aikido. That it's as an example of any art is its practitioners. And I'm deeply touched with any, senior practitioners that I go to. It's like, yeah, this is where I should be.
Yeah. I feel the same. Yeah.
Thank you. What do you think is the future of Aikido? You might be one of the people who are actively engaged in creating it because you have this dojo. I know that O-sensei had a certain kind of vision, which I don't know too much about, but I know that he had a vision when he brought this to the world, or it came through him. How do you see that?
I think with time and distance from O Sensei's original teachings, and even Saito Sensei's teachings too, it's Aikido is sort of balanced on this cusp of, as with any martial tradition, spiritual tradition, religious tradition, the fracturing that happens, which is always ironic when the core teaching is one of unification and coming together in agreement and understanding and harmony, that an art centered around that core concept is also becoming fractured and disparate and disconnected. There's some teachers that are trying to draw those connections together again. And it's, I don't know, it encourages me every time I see a teacher trying to make efforts to embody their understanding of Aikido, share it with the world, and draw connections, not necessarily parallels, but connections to other practitioners, either in the martial arts world broadly, or Aikido specifically, or Iwama Aikido in particular, just to find some way to connect it back together. I don't like the idea that things would become fractured and these little balkanization of Aikido practice, where our dojo is its own separate thing, disconnected from all other Aikido schools, and every school operates in that sort of cult of personality where the sensei is teaching something that's completely different. But the flip side of that is I just read an article recently about you can preserve something to death, that the idea that we should only ever do the thing the way it was done, teach the way it was taught, share the way it was shared, so that we can honor Saito Sensei, who was honoring O Sensei, and only ever do it this one way. That, to me, denies the individual experience, denies the self, the body that has to hold the understanding of Aikido. So I don't pretend to teach O Sensei's Aikido. I don't pretend to teach Saito Sensei's Aikido, because I'm not Saito Sensei and I'm not O Sensei. I am teaching my understanding of Aikido that I hold in my body, that I continue to evolve as I understand myself and through the process of teaching. And that's the closest thing, that coming back to this concept of expertise versus experience. That's all I have to share is my experience. I don't have expertise to share. And I want Aikido teachers that recognize that what they're sharing is their own understanding in their own bodies. Those, to me, are some of the best teachers, really.
I like how you made this distinction between experience versus expertise. Would you briefly want to say a little bit more as to what you see that as difference?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can. I don't know. A lot of times but I have seen myself have this tendency too, where there's this mistaken belief that simply by having done a thing makes you an expert in it. We have this idea that we can get a degree in a thing and then we're an expert in it, or we have a master's or a PhD in a thing and we're an expert in it, or we've done it for 10,000 hours and then we're an expert in it. And our experience is such a continuum. Expertise makes me think that it's an end point, and experience is eternal. We keep learning, we keep experiencing, and that's what I have to share. It's that continually ever-changing experience of myself and my body and my practice and my Aikido.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I feel like there's something very deep in there, perhaps just as earlier you were drawing a distinction between Jitsu and Do and Jitsu, the path and the technique. I think there is some connection there. Briefly on the same subject, O Sensei, talking a little bit about O Sensei, I know very little of the history, but I find it very touching as I've been exposed to a few spiritual traditions, and I have sort of this archetype where I have not stuck to one path, and have a little bit of a scholarly approach to exploring things, while valuing that you have to go deeper into a practice to really learn anything for that matter. So what it seems like that he was very intense, which is a quality I am always touched by when I see in someone. And that he was in a very violent culture, and he also, as a martial art practitioner, he seeked other teachers and fights, and at some point, and was also a spiritual practitioner at the same time, exposed to the Japanese culture, or time point when there was wars going around and a lot of human suffering. And all of these different paths culminated in him having this realization and bringing in Aikido as you mentioned earlier, an art of peace, that the practice itself is transformatory in establishing peace, initially perhaps in Japan, and then in his vision in the world as well. So without actually going to war, having the transformation to see the non-necessity while simultaneously becoming, cultivating whatever your essence of the warrior is.
Yeah, it's hard for me to really hypothesize as to his personal transformation. I think there's a lot written about it, and there's a lot of study to be done on that for sure. But I think you're right. I think that experience of the war, several wars, right? The Sino-Japanese War as well, and Japanese imperialism. There's a phrase in Japanese, I don't know it in Japanese, but the translation is the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, which is the Japanese version of harmony. So when the Japanese speak of harmony, it's like, I have a hammer. I'm going to go find any nails that are sticking up and pound them all flat. And when you apply that to imperialism and colonialism, you can achieve harmony at the end of a sword in a very different way. Harmony is when everybody does what they're supposed to do. That's a very different relationship with harmony than our Western perception of this idealized Eastern philosophical harmony. When we use the word harmony in English, it means like, peace and tranquility. It doesn't involve a hammer, right? There's not a lot of versions of our spiritual idealism that involve a hammer and a nail and like pounding everything flat so that we achieve harmony. So I think part of that realization maybe, and again, this is just hypothesizing, but part of that realization may have come with the results of wars and suffering, having a spiritual idealism of unity, and then realizing that unity brought through war and violence and conquest maybe isn't the unity that benefits all of humanity.
The nail and hammer example reminds me of communism in some ways,
if everybody agrees and plays along, it is very harmonious. And when people feel disadvantaged or taken advantage of or controlled, our human impulse is to fight against that. So it's a difficult balance to strike, I'm sure. I mean, this veers further into politics than spirituality, but I think that it's a
I think that even politics or whatever we see in the world and in our own lives is a reflection of whatever that we have understood. And if harmony is through freedom by choice and understanding, it's a different kind of harmony by imposing my definition of harmony on everybody else. And one other unique thing about sensei, is what I find is common in a lot of traditions as well, before they were not traditions. Is it seems that there was an open exchange or an openness to study with multiple teachers and to test yourself and have that intensity. And I always take that as an example, because if it's like, okay, these are the techniques that have been given to you, this is the way our school operates, in a way that gives reverence in one way, but also it is actually opposite to the essence of the very person who cultivated them, because his approach was the opposite of that. So in terms of sensei, I would say that he was very open in many ways. And at least in myself, I feel like I should, at some level, replicate that, not at the expense of lack of dedication and lack of practice, but not to make anything dogma.
Sure. Yeah.
Is there anything that you think that we might have missed, or you would like to highlight?
No, I don't think so. I had a wide-ranging conversation.
It was very wide-ranging.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's really enjoyable. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nathan Sensei, for being here, and maybe we'll have it again at some point.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kenan.
Yeah. Thank you.